But I gave him 43 more years through my obsession with getting even. But I gave him 43 more years through my obsession with getting even. And the cruelest truth is that revenge doesn't heal wounds, but keeps them open. I spent 40 years believing that making Curtis suffer would somehow undo my suffering. But when I finally destroyed his business and achieved the revenge I'd planned for decades, I felt absolutely nothing. Just emptiness, because I realized the years spent seeking revenge were years I could have spent rebuilding, healing, and creating something new. Time punishes those who live in yesterday, and forgiveness isn't weakness or capitulation. It's refusing to let someone who hurt you continue hurting you. It's taking back control of your emotional life.
I never believed that train stations could be places of confession until the evening of October 23, 2024. That was the night I met a man who would fundamentally alter everything I thought I knew about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for carrying grudges across decades. What he told me in those quiet hours on a bench in Union Station would disturb me, enlighten me, and ultimately lead me here, to you, sharing a truth so uncomfortable yet so essential that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. My name is Branson, and as always, my name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I witnessed, what I learned, and what I'm about to share with you. Because the old man was right about one thing. Revenge does not end a story. It traps you in it. And understanding how that trap works might be the most important warning any of us ever receive about what we choose to carry through our lives. This is that story. It was one of those October evenings when autumn asserts itself completely, the air crisp enough to require a jacket, the light fading earlier each day, the sense of time moving forward whether we're ready or not. I had missed my connecting train to Philadelphia by 15 minutes, a victim of traffic and my own poor planning, and faced a 2-hour wait for the next departure. Union Station's main terminal was its usual chaos of hurried travelers and emotional reunions, so I'd retreated to one of the smaller waiting lounges on the lower level, a dimly lit space that most people passed through without stopping. I'm what you might call an accidental anthropologist. I work as a freelance journalist, though work is perhaps too strong a word for the sporadic assignments that keep me financially afloat. What I really do is collect human stories. I watch people in airports and train stations, in hospital waiting rooms and courthouse corridors, in all those liminal spaces where people's guards come down and their true selves emerge. I've learned more about human nature in these overlooked spaces than I ever did in my 4 years of journalism school. The lounge was nearly empty that evening, just myself, a young woman absorbed in her laptop with headphones creating her own private world, and an elderly man sitting with unusual stillness near the far wall. It was his stillness that caught my attention first. In a space designed for transient waiting, where people fidget and check phones and shift positions every few minutes, he sat with the absolute composure of someone who had learned to be comfortable with uncomfortable thoughts. He appeared to be in his early 80s, though he carried his age with a dignity that made precise estimation difficult. His silver hair was neatly combed, his charcoal overcoat well-maintained if somewhat dated in style, his posture upright despite what must have been 8 decades of gravity's pull. On the bench beside him lay a newspaper, folded with geometric precision, and a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had traveled through several professional lifetimes. But it was his hands that truly captured my attention. They rested on his knees with complete stillness, no drumming fingers, no nervous adjustments, no reaching for a phone to fill the silence. They were steady hands, weathered but strong, the hands of someone who had built things, fixed things, carried weight both literal and metaphorical. And yet there was something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, in the distant focus of his gaze, that spoke of tremendous internal weight. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, not the departure board, not other travelers, not the newspaper beside him. He was simply staring into middle distance, as if watching something only he could see, something that existed in memory rather than present space. I've learned to recognize that particular quality of stillness. It's not the peaceful meditation of someone at ease, but the heavy motionlessness of someone processing something significant. Something that demands to be acknowledged but perhaps doesn't want to be named. I'd been observing him for perhaps 20 minutes when our eyes accidentally met. I'd been pretending to read an article on my phone while actually watching him peripherally, and when I glanced up more directly, I found him looking at me with clear, gray eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Most people, caught in observation, look away quickly or offer an embarrassed smile. This man simply held my gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if acknowledging some unspoken agreement between us. The nod seemed to say, "I see that you see me," and that's acceptable. I found myself standing and walking toward him, though I couldn't have articulated exactly why. Some instinct told me that this man was carrying a story worth hearing, and that perhaps, for reasons I couldn't name, he was ready to share it. Waiting for a late train? I asked as I approached, gesturing to the empty space beside him in silent request for permission to sit. "Always waiting for something," he replied, his voice surprisingly strong despite his age, carrying the faint traces of what might have been a Midwestern accent smoothed by decades of living elsewhere. Though at my age, you start to wonder if waiting is all that's left. There was no self-pity in his tone, just observation. He gestured to the bench, and I sat down, leaving a respectful distance between us. "I'm waiting too," I said. "Missed my connection. 2 hours until the next one." 2 hours, he repeated, as if the time frame held particular significance. That's almost enough time to tell a story properly. Not rushed, but not meandering either. Just enough time to lay out the essential truth of a thing. Something in the way he said it suggested he had a specific story in mind. I waited, a technique I'd learned from years of coaxing narratives from strangers. People rarely need prompting to talk. They just need permission and patience. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost conversationally, "I finally got my revenge today. After 40 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Not that I was counting." The statement landed heavily despite his casual delivery. Revenge. 40 years. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I expected to see satisfaction in his expression, perhaps the grim pleasure of a long-pursued goal finally achieved. Instead, I saw something closer to exhaustion or maybe emptiness, as if he'd climbed a mountain only to discover there was nothing at the summit but the view of the valley he'd left behind. "Did it feel the way you thought it would?" I asked carefully. He turned to look at me fully, and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, that I was actually interested rather than just making polite conversation. "That's a better question than most people would ask," he said. "Most people would ask if I was satisfied, or if he deserved it. But you asked about expectation versus reality. That suggests you understand something important." "What do I understand?" "That revenge is always a disappointment," he said quietly. "Not because it fails. Mine succeeded perfectly in every practical sense. But because the thing you're trying to kill with revenge isn't the person who hurt you. It's the pain itself. And pain, I've learned, cannot be killed by hurting someone else. It can only be transformed by letting it go." He paused, his hands still resting on his knees with that same unsettling stillness. "But that's the conclusion of the story. Would you like to hear how it began? I have 2 hours, and you seem like someone who actually listens. That's rarer than you might think." I had nowhere else to be, and every instinct told me that whatever this man was about to share would be worth the hearing. I'd be honored to listen. The old man settled back slightly against the bench, his gaze returning to that middle distance where memory lived. "My name is Vernon Lattimore," he began. "I'm 81 years old, born in 1943 in a town in Iowa so small it doesn't exist anymore, absorbed into a larger municipality in the 1990s when the population dropped below viable. And I'm going to tell you about the 40 years I spent planning revenge, the moment I finally achieved it, and why succeeding destroyed me in ways that the original betrayal never could." He turned back to me. "But to understand any of that, you need to know who I was before. Because the man sitting here with you now, he's not the same person who was betrayed 4 decades ago. That man died slowly over the years, killed not by his enemy but by his own inability to let the past remain past." Vernon Lattimore took a slow breath and began his story. "I need to start by telling you about the man I was in 1984, Vernon said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had thought through this narrative many times. "Because understanding who I was makes it clearer what I lost, not just to the betrayal, but to the revenge itself. He shifted slightly on the bench, getting comfortable for what would clearly be a long recounting. I was 41 years old, married to a woman named Marlene who I'd met in college, father to 2 children. Diane was 12, Christopher was 9. We lived in a modest house in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Or it would be ours in another 23 years of mortgage payments. Vernon smiled slightly at the memory. I was, by every measure that mattered to me, successful. Not wealthy, not famous, not remarkable in any way that would make history books. But I'd built something real. I owned a small manufacturing company, Lattimore Precision Parts. We made specialized components for industrial machinery. Boring stuff, incredibly boring, but there was satisfaction in it. Every piece we produced had to meet exact specifications. There was no room for close enough. Things either fit perfectly or they were worthless. He paused thoughtfully. I suppose there's a metaphor there somewhere. My whole worldview was built on precision, on things fitting together correctly, on the idea that if you did good work and treated people fairly, the pieces of your life would align properly. I believed in fairness the way some people believe in God, not as an abstract principle but as a fundamental law of how the universe operated. Vernon looked at me directly. That kind of faith in fairness, it's a beautiful thing when life confirms it, but it's a devastating thing when life contradicts it. And I was about to learn just how devastating. He continued, I'd started Lattimore Precision in 1977 with my best friend from college, a man named Curtis Hemmings. We'd known each other since we were 18 years old. We'd been roommates, groomsmen at each other's weddings, godfathers to each other's children. 23 years of friendship. 23 years of trust built day by day, conversation by conversation, shared struggle by shared success. Vernon's expression grew darker. Curtis was brilliant. Better with numbers than I was, better with people, better at seeing opportunities one would have missed. I handled operations and production. He handled finance and sales. It was a perfect partnership. Complementary skills, shared values, mutual respect. By 1984, we'd built the company to 15 employees, consistent profits, a reputation for quality that meant we could charge premium prices. And I trusted him absolutely, Vernon said quietly. That's the detail that matters most. I didn't just trust Curtis with my money. I trusted him with my family's security, with my life's work, with my belief that the world operated according to principles of fairness and loyalty. That kind of trust, once given, makes you profoundly vulnerable. He was silent for a moment, and I could see him turning over memories like stones, examining them for details he might have missed 4 decades ago. The first warning sign came in March of 1984. Our accountant called me, confused about some discrepancies in the books. Nothing major, she said, just some transfers between accounts that didn't match her records. She tried to ask Curtis about it, but he'd been evasive, told her he'd explain later, that he was just moving some funds around for better interest rates. Vernon shook his head slowly. I should have paid attention to that. I should have looked more closely. But I didn't, because looking closely would have meant suspecting Curtis, and suspecting Curtis felt like suspecting my own brother. So I dismissed it. I told the accountant that Curtis knew what he was doing, that I trusted his financial judgment completely. That phrase, I trust him completely, Vernon said with evident bitterness. I must have said it 100 times over the years. To the accountant, to Marlene when she expressed vague worries, to myself when small inconsistencies nagged at the edges of my awareness. I trust him completely. As if saying it enough times could make it true, could protect me from what was actually happening. He took a slow breath. The betrayal revealed itself gradually, then all at once. Small irregularities that I kept explaining away, kept dismissing, kept refusing to see clearly. Until May 17, 1984, when I received a certified letter from our bank informing me that our business line of credit, our financial lifeline for managing cash flow, had been maxed out and payment was severely overdue. Vernon's hands, which had been still on his knees, now gripped them slightly, the only visible sign of the emotion he was recounting. I called Curtis immediately. He was on a business trip, he said, meeting with potential clients in Chicago. He'd be back in 2 days and we'd sort everything out, probably just a banking error. His voice was so calm, so reassuring, so familiar. The voice of my best friend telling me not to worry. But I did worry, Vernon continued. For the first time in 23 years of friendship, I felt a cold suspicion settle in my stomach. So I went to the office early the next morning before anyone else arrived, and I did what I should have done months earlier. I looked at the books. Really looked at them. His expression grew distant, as if he were seeing those spreadsheets again, understanding dawning line by line. Curtis had been embezzling for at least 2 years, maybe longer. Sophisticated theft, the kind that required deep knowledge of our systems and complete access to our accounts. Money transferred to shell companies, invoices for services never rendered, payments to suppliers that didn't exist. He'd stolen almost $300,000, about $2 million in today's money when you account for inflation. Vernon's voice was barely above a whisper now. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what he'd left behind. A company so hollowed out financially that it couldn't survive. Debts I didn't know we'd incurred. Equipment purchased on credit that we couldn't afford. Contracts signed with terms that would bankrupt us. He'd set up the company's collapse, time to occur after he'd extracted everything of value and disappeared. Curtis never came back from that business trip, Vernon said flatly. He'd flown to Chicago, then from Chicago to the Cayman Islands, where I later learned he'd been transferring money to offshore accounts for months. By the time I discovered the theft, he was already gone, beyond the reach of any law that might have helped me recover what he'd stolen. Vernon looked at me with eyes that still, 40 years later, held the shock of that betrayal. Do you understand what that kind of discovery does to a person? It's not just learning that someone stole from you. It's learning that your entire understanding of reality was wrong. Every conversation I'd had with Curtis for 2 years had been a lie. Every time he'd looked me in the eye and talked about our company, our future, our shared success, he was already planning to destroy it all. The practical consequences were catastrophic, Vernon continued. I spent every penny I had trying to save the company, but the debt was too deep. Lattimore Precision Parts filed for bankruptcy in October of 1984. 15 people lost their jobs. I lost everything I'd built in 7 years of work. The house went into foreclosure. Marlene and I had to move the children to a tiny apartment, explain to them why they had to change schools, why suddenly there was no money for the things they'd taken for granted. His voice grew heavier. But the emotional consequences, those were worse. Because Curtis hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my ability to trust. My belief in fairness. My faith that people you loved wouldn't destroy you for personal gain. Every relationship in my life became suspect. If Curtis could betray me after 23 years, then anyone could betray me at any time. The world went from a place with reliable patterns to a place of constant potential threat. Vernon paused, seeming to gather himself. And in the midst of all that loss and grief and shock, one emotion emerged stronger than all the others, the need for revenge. Not justice, revenge. Justice would have been Curtis arrested, tried, imprisoned, forced to return what he'd stolen. But Curtis was beyond the reach of justice, living comfortably in a country with no extradition treaty, protected by the same careful planning he'd used to steal from me. So revenge became my obsession, Vernon said quietly. Not immediately. At first, I was too busy trying to survive the collapse, trying to keep my family together, trying to find a new job and rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But underneath all of that, burning like a coal that never quite went cold, was the absolute certainty that someday, somehow, I would make Curtis pay for what he'd done. He looked at me directly. And that obsession, that burning coal of revenge, it would cost me the next 40 years of my life. Not all at once, but slowly, degree by degree, it would consume everything that mattered until revenge was the only thing left. Vernon settled back against the bench, and I could see the weight of memory pressing down on him. This was clearly the part of the story that was hardest to tell, not the betrayal itself, but what the betrayal had done to him across the decades that followed. The thing about revenge, Vernon said, his voice taking on a thoughtful, almost clinical tone, is that it doesn't announce itself as self-destruction. It presents itself as righteous determination, as refusal to be defeated, as maintaining your dignity by refusing to forget. It feels like strength, not weakness, like purpose, not obsession. He turned to look at me. That's how it trapped me. If I'd recognized revenge for what it was, a poison I was drinking while hoping Curtis would die, I might have stopped. But I convinced myself that planning revenge was the same as maintaining my integrity, that letting go of the grudge would be the same as admitting Curtis had won. Vernon's expression grew distant again as he reached back across the years. In the immediate aftermath of the bankruptcy, I was too consumed with survival to actively pursue revenge. I took a job as a production manager at a larger manufacturing firm, a massive step down from owning my own company, but it paid the bills. Marlene went back to work as a school secretary. We moved into that cramped apartment and tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy for the kids. But every night, Vernon continued, after Marlene and the children were asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table with whatever information I'd managed to gather about Curtis. Where he was living, what he was doing, how he was spending the money he'd stolen. This was before the internet made information easy to find, so I had to work for every scrap of knowledge. Private investigators I could barely afford. Friends in the Cayman Islands who'd see him around town and report back. Careful, methodical tracking of a man who thought he'd escaped consequences. His voice grew harder, and I learned that Curtis was thriving, living in a beautiful house, starting a new business with my money, dating younger women, sailing, playing golf, living the life he'd always wanted while I worked 60-hour weeks to pay off debts that he'd created. The injustice of it was like acid in my stomach. Every piece of good news about his life felt like a new betrayal. Vernon paused. Marlene knew I was obsessed. She tried to talk to me about it, gently at first, then more urgently as the years passed. She'd say, "Vernon, this is eating you alive. He took 7 years of your life when he destroyed the company. Don't give him the rest of it." But I couldn't hear her, because in my mind, letting go meant Curtis got away with it. And I couldn't accept that. He looked down at his hands, still resting on his knees. The obsession reshaped everything about who I was. I became suspicious of everyone. When colleagues at my new job were friendly, I wondered what they wanted from me. When neighbors invited us over, I looked for ulterior motives. I couldn't accept kindness at face value because kindness was what Curtis had shown me for 23 years before destroying me. My children suffered, Vernon said quietly, and this seemed to pain him more than anything else he'd shared. Diane and Christopher, they needed a father who was present, engaged, interested in their lives. Instead, they got a man who was physically there but emotionally elsewhere. I'd be at Diane's piano recital, but thinking about Curtis. At Christopher's baseball games, but mentally reviewing possible revenge scenarios. I loved my children, but I couldn't be fully present for them because so much of my mental energy was consumed by the past. Vernon's expression grew more pained. Diane once said to me when she was 16, I remember the exact words because they cut so deeply, she said, "Dad, Curtis took your company. Are you going to let him take your family too?" And I told her, angrily, that she didn't understand, that I was working to provide for the family, that everything I did was for them. But she was right. I was letting revenge poison the present while pretending I was protecting the future. Marlene left me in 1992, Vernon said flatly. 8 years after the betrayal. She said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore, couldn't compete with a ghost from the past for my attention, couldn't raise our children in a household dominated by resentment and absence. She didn't leave because she stopped loving me. She left because the man she'd married had been replaced by someone else, someone consumed by rage and revenge. He was quiet for a long moment. And you know what my first thought was when she told me she was leaving? Not grief, not panic at losing my family. My first thought was, Curtis took this from me too. As if Curtis bore responsibility for the choices I'd made, the attention I'd refused to give, the obsession I'd chosen over presence. I blamed him for the divorce instead of recognizing that I'd driven Marlene away through my own fixation. Vernon shook his head slowly. That's how insidious revenge is. It doesn't just consume you, it makes you blame the object of your revenge for the damage you're doing to yourself. It creates this narrative where you're the victim of ongoing harm rather than the architect of ongoing self-destruction. After the divorce, things got worse, Vernon continued. Without Marlene's moderating influence, without the daily demands of family life, I had more time and energy to devote to tracking Curtis, to planning revenge, to imagining the moment when I'd finally make him pay. I'd spend entire weekends researching, planning, building dossiers of information. I knew more about Curtis's life than I knew about my own children's lives. He looked at me with something that might have been shame. Christopher invited me to his college graduation in 1995. I didn't go. I told him I had to work, but the truth was I had a meeting scheduled with a private investigator who'd promised new information about Curtis's business dealings. I chose revenge over my son's graduation. And Christopher, to his credit, never forgave me for that. We haven't spoken in 15 years. Vernon's voice grew quieter. Diane tried to maintain a relationship, but even that became strained. She'd call occasionally, update me on her life, her marriage, the birth of my grandchildren. And I'd listen, but I wouldn't really hear. I'd be pleasant enough, but distant. Present in the conversation the way I'd been present at her childhood recitals, physically there but mentally elsewhere. I turned down promotions at work because they'd require too much travel, too much focus, too much energy that I wanted to devote to revenge. I never remarried, never even dated seriously, because how could I trust anyone enough for intimacy when my best friend of 23 years had destroyed me? I lived in the same small apartment for decades because I told myself I didn't want to get comfortable until Curtis had paid. My entire life became an exercise in delayed living, in waiting for revenge before I allowed myself to move forward. Vernon's expression grew even more distant. And the cruelest part? Curtis didn't know. He had no idea I was dedicating my entire existence to his eventual downfall. He'd gone on with his life, probably rarely thinking about me, while I was arranging my entire world around him. He was living rent-free in my mind, consuming my emotional energy, shaping my choices, and he didn't even know it. He turned back to me. That's the thing about revenge that nobody tells you. It makes you give your enemy power over your present and your future, not just your past. Curtis had stolen 7 years of my life when he destroyed my company. But my obsession with revenge gave him another 33 years. He took what he wanted and moved on. I gave him everything else voluntarily, one day at a time, through my inability to let go. Vernon paused, his hands finally moving from his knees to rub his face in a gesture of exhaustion. And through all of this, through the lost relationships, the missed opportunities, the decades of diminished living, I told myself I was doing the right thing. That revenge was justice delayed. That patience was a virtue. That someday, when I finally made Curtis pay, all of this sacrifice would be worth it. That belief, that revenge would somehow redeem the time I'd spent pursuing it, that's what kept me going for 40 years, Vernon said. It had to be worth it, because if it wasn't, then I'd wasted my entire adult life on a delusion. And that possibility was too terrible to contemplate, so I didn't contemplate it. I just kept going, kept planning, kept waiting for the opportunity that would finally make everything make sense. He looked at me with eyes that had seen the error far too late to correct it. Shall I tell you about that opportunity? About the moment I'd been waiting for decades to arrive? I nodded, completely absorbed in Vernon's story, dreading what I knew was coming. The revelation that revenge, achieved after such cost, would bring nothing but emptiness. The opportunity came in 2019, Vernon said, his voice taking on a different quality, less reflective, more narrative, as if he were reporting events rather than processing their meaning. 35 years after the betrayal. I was 76 years old. Curtis was 77. 2 old men, though I didn't think of us that way. In my mind, we were still the 41-year-olds we'd been when he destroyed my life. Vernon shifted on the bench, settling in for what was clearly a crucial part of his story. Curtis had returned to the United States. I'd been tracking him carefully enough to know he'd been back for about 5 years, living in Florida under his own name, apparently believing that enough time had passed that no one cared about his crimes anymore. And legally, he was probably right. The statute of limitations on the embezzlement had long since expired. He couldn't be prosecuted, even if I'd wanted to pursue that route. But I didn't want legal justice, Vernon admitted. I wanted revenge. Personal, direct, devastating revenge. I wanted Curtis to experience the kind of loss he'd inflicted on me. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have everything destroyed. Vernon's expression grew more animated, as if reliving those moments. I learned that Curtis had built another successful business in Florida, a consulting firm for small manufacturers, of all the cruel ironies. He was advising companies on financial management, helping them avoid the kinds of problems he'd deliberately created in our company. The hypocrisy was stunning. But more importantly, Vernon continued, I learned that Curtis's company was built on a foundation of lies similar to the ones he'd told me. Inflated credentials, false success stories, relationships with clients based on fabricated expertise. He'd learned nothing. He was still the same man, still running the same cons, just in a different context. Vernon's voice grew harder. And I realized I finally had what I needed, comprehensive documentation of Curtis's fraud, both past and present. Evidence that would destroy his business, his reputation, his comfortable retirement. Evidence that I'd been gathering piece by piece for decades, supplemented by new information about his current fraud. I had enough to ruin him completely. The method was simple, Vernon said. I created a comprehensive dossier, hundreds of pages of documentation showing Curtis's pattern of fraud across 4 decades. The embezzlement from our company, cross-referenced with public records. His current business practices, documented through undercover work I'd paid investigators to conduct. False credentials, fabricated case studies, fraudulent financial advice. Everything meticulously researched, carefully documented, legally bulletproof. Vernon's hands gripped his knees again. And I sent it everywhere. To his clients, to industry regulators, to the media, to law enforcement. I published it online through multiple channels, making sure it would remain accessible and searchable forever. Curtis's name became permanently linked to fraud. Every potential client who searched for him would find the documentation of his crimes. His business collapsed within weeks. I watched it happen from my apartment in Cleveland, Vernon said, and there was something terrible in his voice, not triumph, but a kind of horrified fascination. I'd set up alerts for Curtis's name, so I saw every article, every regulatory action, every client statement, every consequence. His consulting firm shut down. His personal reputation destroyed. His comfortable retirement demolished. Everything he'd built with my stolen money, torn apart by information I'd spent 40 years gathering. Vernon was quiet for a moment. And do you know what I felt, watching the revenge I'd spent 40 years planning finally come to fruition? What? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Nothing, Vernon said flatly. Absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no sense of justice served. Just emptiness. As if I'd climbed a mountain for 4 decades and discovered there was no summit, just more mountain, extending forever in all directions. He turned to face me fully. I'd imagined this moment so many times. In my imagination, exposing Curtis would bring closure, would heal the wound, would somehow make the past 40 years of sacrifice worth it. I'd pictured myself feeling vindicated, triumphant, finally free from the burden of resentment I'd carried for so long. Instead, Vernon continued, his voice almost wondering, I felt hollow. Because I realized, watching Curtis's world collapse, that nothing about the past had changed. My company was still gone. My marriage had still failed. My relationship with my children was still broken. The decades I'd spent in obsessive planning were still wasted. Revenge had changed nothing about any of that. Vernon's expression grew more troubled. And worse, far worse, I realized that the man I destroyed wasn't really the man who'd betrayed me. Oh, it was the same person physically, same name, same face aged 40 years. But Curtis at 77 wasn't Curtis at 41. He'd lived an entire life in those 4 decades, experienced his own losses and regrets, become someone different in ways I'd refused to acknowledge because I needed him to remain the villain of my story. I learned later, Vernon said quietly, that Curtis's wife had died of cancer in 2015, that he'd nursed her through 2 years of illness, devastated by her loss, that he'd started the consulting business partly to have something to do, some way to feel useful in the emptiness after her death. None of that excused what he'd done to me, but it complicated the simple narrative I'd been carrying for 40 years. His voice grew even softer, and I realized that in destroying his late-life business, I'd taken from an old man the one thing giving his retirement meaning. I'd imagined revenge would make me feel powerful, but instead it made me feel cruel. Because cruelty to a 77-year-old man, even one who'd committed terrible crimes at 41, still felt like cruelty. Vernon looked down at his hands. The revenge succeeded perfectly in every practical sense. Curtis's business was destroyed, his reputation ruined, his comfortable life shattered. By every measure I'd spent 40 years imagining, it was a complete success. And yet it felt like the most profound failure of my life. Because I finally understood what Marlene had tried to tell me back in 1992, Vernon said. That revenge doesn't heal wounds, it keeps them open. That the years I'd spent planning revenge were years I could have spent rebuilding, healing, creating something new. That Curtis had taken 7 years from me through betrayal, but I'd given him 43 more years through obsession. Vernon was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing emotions that were clearly still raw despite the passage of time. After I destroyed Curtis's business, I sat in my apartment for 3 days, unable to move, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but confront the reality I'd been avoiding for 40 years. I'd wasted my life. His voice cracked slightly. Diane, my daughter, she's 52 now. I've missed her entire adult life. Missed her wedding, missed the births of my grandchildren, missed birthday parties and holidays and all the ordinary moments that make up a family. Not because I was prevented from participating, but because I chose revenge over presence. I chose nursing a 40-year-old wound over building new relationships. Christopher won't speak to me, and I don't blame him, Vernon continued. I skipped his college graduation for a meeting with a private investigator. What kind of father does that? What kind of man chooses revenge over his own child's milestone? A man who's lost himself so completely to obsession that he can't even recognize what matters anymore. Vernon looked at me with eyes full of regret. And Marlene, she remarried in 1995. I learned this from Diane. Married a high school teacher named Robert who, by all accounts, was present and engaged and actually capable of living in the moment instead of the past. They had 14 years together before he died. 14 years of the kind of partnership I could have offered her if I'd been able to let go of revenge. I'm 81 years old, Vernon said quietly. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment, eat most meals by myself, have no meaningful relationships, no hobbies, no interests beyond what I've been doing for 40 years. And the revenge I spent all that time planning? It didn't make me happy. It didn't heal me. It didn't change the past. It just confirmed that I'd thrown away my life chasing something that was worthless even if I caught it. Vernon took a slow breath. People talk about revenge as if it's sweet, as if there's satisfaction in making someone else suffer. But that's not what revenge feels like when you actually achieve it after decades of obsession. It feels like looking in a mirror and seeing a stranger, someone who sacrificed everything meaningful for something meaningless, someone who chose yesterday over today over and over until there were no tomorrows left. He turned to look at me directly. The most painful part? Curtis probably barely remembers me. The betrayal that defined my entire adult life was probably just one business decision among many for him. I was a supporting character in his story while he was the protagonist of mine. I gave him 40 years of my emotional energy, and he likely thought about me less than once a year. Vernon's voice grew almost clinical. That's the final cruelty of long-term revenge. The person you're obsessed with usually isn't obsessed with you. You're organizing your entire life around them while they're living their own life, making their own choices, moving forward. The imbalance is staggering. I sat in silence, absorbing everything Vernon had shared. The tragedy wasn't just the original betrayal. It was how Vernon had let that betrayal metastasize, consuming decade after decade until revenge was all that remained. "So what now?" I asked finally. "After achieving the revenge you spent 40 years planning, where do you go from here?" Vernon was quiet for a long moment, then he said something that would haunt me for weeks afterward. "Nowhere. That's the point. I'm 81 years old. I can't get back the time I wasted. I can't repair the relationships I destroyed. I can't undo the choices I made. I can't become the man I could have been if I'd chosen forgiveness over revenge. Time punishes those who live in yesterday, and I've been living in yesterday for 43 years. Vernon and I sat in silence for several minutes after he finished speaking. The train station lounge had grown even quieter, the young woman with the laptop having departed at some point during his story. We were alone now, two strangers who had briefly intersected, one carrying a story too heavy to keep entirely to himself. "I'm sorry," I said finally, though the words felt inadequate. "For what Curtis did to you, and for what revenge cost you." Vernon nodded slowly. "Thank you. Though I've come to understand that the apology I need most is one I can't receive, because it would have to come from my younger self. If 41-year-old Vernon could somehow speak to 81-year-old Vernon, I'd beg him to let it go. To grieve the betrayal, to feel the anger, to acknowledge the injustice, but then to release it and move forward. To choose his marriage over his grudge. To choose his children over his revenge. To choose life over the death of someone else's comfort." He turned to look at me. "But that's the thing about time, isn't it? We can't send messages backward. We can only send them forward. So I'm telling you this story not to gain sympathy, but as a warning. If you're carrying a grudge, nursing a resentment, planning revenge against someone who hurt you, let it go. Whatever they took from you, don't give them more by letting the injury define your future." Vernon's voice grew more urgent. "Because revenge isn't justice. Justice is administered by neutral parties according to established principles. Justice can bring closure. But revenge? Revenge is just organized resentment, and resentment is poison you drink while hoping someone else dies. The only person revenge truly destroys is the person seeking it." "I spent 40 years believing that revenge would heal me," Vernon said. "That making Curtis suffer would somehow undo my suffering. That destroying his life would rebuild mine. But suffering isn't a finite resource that gets redistributed when you inflict it on someone else. It just multiplies. Curtis suffered when I destroyed his business, yes. But his suffering didn't reduce mine. It just added more suffering to the world." Vernon stood slowly from the bench, gathering his newspaper and briefcase. "I should go. I have a train to catch myself. Back to Cleveland, back to my empty apartment, back to whatever remains of a life that I spent on revenge." "Before you go," I said, standing as well, "can I ask you one more question?" "Of course. If you could go back to May 1984, to the moment you discovered Curtis's betrayal, what would you tell yourself?" Vernon was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I'd tell myself that this betrayal, as devastating as it feels, is not the story of your life. It's one chapter, one terrible chapter, but you get to write the rest of the book. Don't let one chapter define every page that follows. Feel the pain, acknowledge the injustice, grieve what you've lost, but then close that chapter and start the next one." He adjusted his coat, preparing to leave. "And I tell myself that forgiveness isn't weakness or capitulation. Forgiveness is refusing to let someone who hurt you continue hurting you. It's taking back control of your emotional life. It's choosing freedom over the prison of perpetual resentment." Vernon extended his hand, and I shook it, feeling the papery skin and surprising strength of his grip. "Thank you for listening. Most people don't really listen, they just wait for their turn to talk. But you listened. That's a gift." "Thank you for sharing," I replied. "I won't forget this." "Good," Vernon said. "Learn from my mistakes. Don't waste your life on revenge. It's never worth it." With that, Vernon Lattimore walked slowly toward the exit of the waiting lounge, his posture still straight despite the weight of his story, his steps measured and deliberate. I watched him disappear into the main terminal, another anonymous elderly traveler in a sea of people, carrying a story that most would never hear. I sat back down on the bench, my mind reeling from everything I'd learned. Vernon's story had the weight of lived truth, not constructed narrative or moral fable, but the raw testimony of someone who had learned a terrible lesson through terrible cost. I thought about the 40 years Vernon had spent planning revenge. 40 years of tracking Curtis's movements, gathering information, building dossiers. 40 years of missing his children's milestones, neglecting his marriage, refusing new relationships. 40 years of choosing yesterday over today, over and over, until all the todays were gone and only yesterday remained. And for what? For a moment of revenge that brought no satisfaction, no healing, no restoration. For the hollow victory of destroying an old man's business, an act that changed nothing about the past and damaged the present for both of them. I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. My train would be arriving in about 30 minutes. I had time to process, to sit with Vernon's story, to understand what it meant for my own life. Because if I was honest with myself, I was carrying my own grudges. Nothing as dramatic as Vernon's 40-year obsession, but smaller resentments nonetheless. The former colleague who'd taken credit for my work. The ex-girlfriend who'd betrayed my trust. The family member who'd said something unforgivable at a holiday gathering 3 years ago. I'd been nursing these resentments, keeping them alive through periodic mental rehearsal, planning elaborate confrontations that would probably never happen. Vernon's story was a mirror, showing me what those resentments could become if I let them. They might never consume 40 years of my life, but they were already consuming days, weeks, hours of mental energy that could be spent on something life-giving instead of life-draining. I sat there in the quiet lounge, feeling something shift inside me. Vernon's story had been a gift, though not one he'd probably intended to give. It was a warning about the cost of revenge, yes, but more than that, it was permission to let go. Permission to close the chapter without needing the perfect ending. Permission to forgive not because the offense was forgivable, but because carrying it was unbearable. 20 minutes before my train's departure, I stood to leave the lounge. As I gathered my things, I noticed something on the bench where Vernon had been sitting. A small, worn photograph, half tucked beneath the newspaper he'd left behind. I picked it up carefully. It showed 2 young men, probably in their early 20s, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the easy confidence of youth. They stood in front of what looked like a newly rented office space, a hand-painted sign above them reading Lattimore and Hemmings Precision Parts. Vernon and Curtis, 43 years ago, at the beginning of their partnership. Before the betrayal. Before the revenge. When they were still friends who believed in each other, who saw a shared future stretching ahead of them. I stared at that photograph for a long time, at those 2 young men who had no idea what was coming. One would betray the other. The other would spend 40 years seeking revenge. And both would ultimately lose. One his business and reputation, the other his entire life. I slipped the photograph into my jacket pocket, intending to find a way to return it to Vernon. But as I walked toward the main terminal, I realized he'd probably left it intentionally. A final discarding of the past, perhaps. Or maybe he'd simply forgotten it, so consumed with his story that physical mementos no longer mattered. I boarded my train and found my seat, watching Philadelphia's skyline grow closer through the window. And I thought about Vernon's final words. Time punishes those who live in yesterday. 3 days after my encounter with Vernon, I did something I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I sent a message to the former colleague who'd taken credit for my work, not to confront or accuse, but simply to say that I was letting go of my resentment and wished him well. The response was awkward and somewhat defensive, but it didn't matter. The message wasn't really for him, it was for me. It was closing a chapter. Over the following weeks, I reached out to the other people I'd been holding grudges against. Not to reconcile necessarily, but to release. To close those chapters without needing perfect endings, without needing apologies or acknowledgments. To stop giving them rent-free space in my mind. And I felt lighter. Not healed completely, some wounds take time to truly close, but lighter. Free in a way I hadn't felt in years. About 6 weeks after meeting Vernon, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thank you for listening." The message was brief. "I don't know if you remember me, The old man from the train station who told you about his wasted life seeking revenge. You gave me your card before I left. I found it in my coat pocket later, so I hope you don't mind me reaching out. After our conversation, I did something I haven't done in 15 years. I called my daughter. We talked for 3 hours. I apologized for missing so much of her life, for choosing revenge over presence. I told her your words about forgiveness, that it's not weakness but freedom. Diane said she'd like to try rebuilding our relationship, slowly. She invited me to meet my grandchildren. I'm traveling to her home next month. I can't get back the 40 years I wasted, but maybe I can make the time I have left count for something. Maybe I can be present for what remains instead of trapped in what's gone. Thank you for listening without judgment. Sometimes we need to tell our stories to strangers before we can change them. Vernon. I read that email several times, feeling something warm and hopeful expand in my chest. Vernon's story wouldn't have a happy ending. Too much had been lost for that. But maybe it could have a better ending than it was heading toward. Maybe the last years of his life could be about connection instead of revenge, about presence instead of resentment. I thought about responding but ultimately decided not to. Vernon's journey forward was his own to walk. My role had simply been to listen at the moment when he needed to be heard. But I saved that email, and occasionally I still reread it when I find myself nursing a grudge or planning some small revenge. It reminds me of what Vernon learned too late, that revenge doesn't end stories, it traps you in them. That the years spent seeking revenge are years that could have been spent living. 6 months after meeting Vernon, I was assigned to write an article about elder isolation for a magazine I occasionally freelance for. While researching, I came across an obituary that stopped me cold. Vernon Lattimore had died at age 81, just 4 months after our conversation. The obituary was brief, mentioning his early career as a business owner, his later work in manufacturing, and his survival by his daughter Diane, son-in-law Marcus, and 3 grandchildren. There was a detail that caught my attention. In lieu of flowers, the family requested donations to a mediation center specializing in business disputes. The note explained that Vernon had become an advocate in his final months for mediation and forgiveness over litigation and revenge. I sat with that information for a long time. Vernon had only lived 4 months after choosing to let go of his 40-year obsession. 4 months of trying to rebuild a relationship with his daughter. 4 months of being present instead of trapped in the past. It seemed unbearably unfair. That Vernon should finally understand the cost of revenge, finally choose a different path, finally start rebuilding, only to have death cut short that rebuilding. But then I thought about it differently. Vernon had spent 40 years seeking revenge and achieving it, only to discover it brought nothing but emptiness. But he'd spent his final 4 months attempting reconciliation, being present for his daughter and grandchildren, advocating for forgiveness over revenge. Which 4 months do you think he treasured more? Which 4 months actually mattered? I've never told Vernon's full story to anyone until now. I've shared pieces of it, used elements in my writing, referenced his wisdom in conversations about forgiveness. But the complete narrative, the 40 years of obsession, the hollow triumph of revenge, the too late recognition of what was truly lost, I've kept that to myself. Until now. Because Vernon was right. Sometimes we need to tell stories to strangers. And sometimes those stories need to be shared more widely, as warnings about paths we should avoid and truths we should recognize before it's too late. Revenge does not end a story. It traps you in it. That's what Vernon learned too late to redeem the lost years, but not too late to change the ending. And that's why I'm sharing his story with you. Because maybe you're carrying a grudge. Maybe you're nursing a resentment. Maybe you're planning some revenge, grand or small, convinced that it will bring satisfaction or healing or justice. Let me tell you what Vernon learned, it won't. Revenge might bring temporary satisfaction, but it extracts a price far greater than that moment of triumph is worth. Every day spent planning revenge is a day not spent building something meaningful. Every hour spent nursing resentment is an hour not spent cultivating joy. The people who hurt us don't deserve our ongoing emotional energy. They took something from us once. Don't give them more by making that theft the center of your life. Close the chapter. Not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve freedom. Not because the offense wasn't real, but because carrying it is costing you the life you could be living. Vernon Lattimore spent 40 years seeking revenge and achieved it perfectly. And in achieving it, he discovered that he'd wasted 40 years. Don't make this mistake. Don't spend your life in yesterday while today slips away unnoticed. Don't let revenge trap you in a story that's already over. Choose freedom. Choose presence. Choose life. Because time punishes those who live in yesterday, not through what it takes, but through what you miss while looking backward. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the 11th Hour Tales for more eye-opening tales every day.